Good afternoon. I am Mary Reese, the Director of Special Projects at NJPSA and FEA. And for more than 16 years, I've had the pleasure to serve as the NJPSA liaison with the ELL Supervisors Committee, a wonderful group of passionate and committed educators who care about our ELLs, their teachers, and their families. Since the recent inception of remote learning, our committee has met weekly to discuss the successes and the challenges associated with our new way of schooling. We agreed that there are key topics that would interest the field, so we decided to offer this webinar series. Last Monday, we had a very successful and informative session, and this is our second and final in the series. We would like you to add your questions to the question box as we move forward with this webinar. If the presenters are able to respond to them, they will. Otherwise, we will send to all participants responses to the questions that have been asked. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Negrin, who is a supervisor in the Vineland Public Schools. She's the chair of our illustrious committee, and she's also the NJPSA Visionary Supervisor of this year. Joanne?
Mary, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for joining us today. We know that you have a lot of demands on your time, and I'm very grateful that you've decided to spend your time with us learning how to best serve your English language learners. Having gone through this process last week, I will give you the suggestion that if you write a question in the box, please try to be specific. Your presenters today will try to answer at that moment if they can. If they're not able to do that, they're going to go back later and try to answer your questions. So just if you can help them to give you the best answer possible by making sure that they know exactly what you're referring to, that will be really helpful. So thank you so much for doing that. And so without any further waiting, I am going to introduce you to one of our presenters today, a good friend and colleague of mine. Julie Ochoa is the supervisor of ESL and bilingual education for the Franklin Township Public Schools in Somerset County. So Julie, take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'd like to also introduce Violetta Katsikis, who will be co-presenting with me. We are very happy to be with you in this presentation, which is one of three topics that we're having today. The first one is assessing progress of our English learners, and that's what we are going to talk about first. We will then have a second mini session on supporting families, and then lastly we will have a session on social and emotional learning in this time of remote learning. So today, Violetta and I are starting with assessing progress of English learners, and I'd love to have Violetta introduce herself at this time. Next slide, please.
Good afternoon, I'm Violetta Katsikis, one of the supervisors of curriculum and instruction for the Cherry Hill School District. Next slide, please. So we have three main goals this afternoon, including we'd like to explore various ways to assess our ELLs using technology platforms like Seesaw, Flipgrid, RazKids, and then without technology using rubrics and other informal assessments. Our third goal is really to learn along with you and to learn from you. So we ask that in addition to submitting questions in the question box, that you also share any strategies that anyone listening today, as well as Julie and I, could learn from you and what has worked successfully for you in your districts. Next slide, please. Before we dig into the assessments, we need to ensure that our ELLs and their families are well. So earlier this month, I recently read on teachingchannel.com a blog written by Sarah Otto. She's the founder and director of Confianza. And in her blog, she reminded us of three very important things we need to do for our ESL families. They are comfort, communicate, and connect. Focusing on comforting students by addressing their basic needs, including meals, devices, access to internet. Communication, focusing on accessible two-way communication. Are messages getting to families? And if not, how can we adjust? focusing on the power of relationships to get through these challenging times. And I found this last bullet quite interesting coming from the curriculum perspective. Sarah challenges us to find ways that we can capitalize on families' funds of knowledge and weave that into our instruction, in addition to our board-approved curriculum or our official curriculum. How can we utilize what we have with students at home to our advantage? Next slide, please. It's so important to remember that instruction looks different. Our teachers are not in the classroom. They're not able to mimic what's done in the classroom. So our assessments will look different too. We need to be patient. We need to be kind. Teachers especially, be kind to yourselves and be creative. Next slide, please. So some of the common concerns we've been hearing about assessments focus on reliability, access, and equity. Some students may have missing or late assignments on record because they don't have access to technology, whether it be a device or access to a hotspot to submit assignments. Others have the access, but they're new to some of these platforms like Google Classroom, and navigating new platforms while also learning a new language is quite a task. Online schooling during this pandemic has really exacerbated some of the inequities that were already there. So we have to work even harder to provide access and equity for our students. Next slide, please. So how do we overcome these challenges? I'm going to share just a few examples that our wonderful ESL teachers from the Cherry Hill School District have shared with me, and some things that have worked successfully, and I hope that they can help you in your districts as well. In this first example, this is a kindergarten example, kindergarten student and our ESL teacher. She established a weekly routine that allows her to informally assess reading, writing, vocabulary, speaking, and listening, all in the same week. So on Mondays and Tuesdays, the students select a vocab word from a provided list, and they draw a picture and submit via Flipgrid. On Wednesday, the student uses a Google Form survey to make a prediction before listening to the text. After listening to a text, students use that same Google Form survey to confirm if their prediction was correct with a simple yes, my prediction was correct, or no. And then by Thursday, the student uses Flipgrid for a response to literature, and they record and tell about their favorite part. We'll take a second just to hear an example now.
But my favorite part is the boy saying, "Stop noising."
And then on Friday, it's a bit of a challenge for our students, but our kindergartners are able to do this. They listen to their classmates' responses on the Flipgrid platform, and then they either respond to a classmate or respond to the teacher's feedback that's provided. Focusing on the assessment in this example, the expectation for the kindergarten ELLs was to use complete sentences and then begin to build on their answers. The teacher scaffolded and differentiated by providing sentence frames for the beginners. She also provided a sample video of each of the steps, modeling each of the steps for her students. She emphasized that she was very lenient with her assessment criteria since the students were completing this at home and it required at-home support. She provided direct feedback through Google Classroom in the form of private comments, and she also used the editable feature that's provided in Flipgrid to assess three main things. 1, did the students speak clearly? 2, was the output comprehensible? And 3, if they spoke in complete sentences. Next slide, please. In this elementary example, the teacher focused on the scale of comparing and contrasting. The students were provided a photo of a bat and a bird, and they were asked to compare and contrast the two animals and then upload either a video or an audio through the Seesaw platform. Expectations varied by language level. Beginners were expected to provide at least words and phrases, intermediate learners several sentences, and our advanced students a full paragraph with an opening, a closing, and some transitions. And then the teacher utilized the WIDA speaking rubric to assess students' performance based on proficiency. We'll listen to a grade 4 example now.
Bat and birds are same in many ways, same and different in many ways. First it is same because they both have wings and they both fly. And also they are small. And it is different because bird are birds and bats are mammals. And birds can be colorful, and bird has many more kinds than bats. Bats doesn't have a lot of colors. Birds can be colorful.
In this third example, the teacher uses a combination of RAS Kids. Next slide, please. RAS Kids, Seesaw, and the WIDA rubrics to assess speaking, writing, listening, and reading. And although this sounds challenging, I think it's important to note that these routines and these particular platforms were used throughout the year with these students. So when they transitioned to at-home learning, it was something that was already familiar. I think that's important to know ahead of time. So the students would listen to, self-select a text and would listen to a text or read the text depending on their proficiency level in RAS Kids multiple times. Then they would submit a recording of themselves reading up to 5 minutes, reading directly from the book on RAS Kids. The teacher could utilize this reading sample to assess their fluency, their decoding skills, and to identify any areas of focus for future lessons. Then the students would take a quiz. This would measure their reading or listening comprehension. After being successful in the quiz, the students would retell the story on Seesaw. Again, teacher utilizes the WIDA speaking rubric, and then write a summary through Seesaw. So we utilize their writing to assess their writing. So using the WIDA speaking and listening rubrics, the teacher is able to informally assess students' progress while they're at home. Next slide, please. RAS Kids provides the example of the student reading aloud, and you can follow along with a text. Here's a short snippet of the student reading a text about making ice.
That is in the ice. Have you ever made ice cubes in a freezer? I could make giant blocks of ice. Then they turn the blocks into white of ice. I test use big machines that make clear ice. Sometimes they also use white ice.
So that provides an example of what teachers can hear and see utilizing the RAS Kids platform. Next slide, please. In this example, the teacher, high school teacher, utilizes the National Geographic Cengage EDGE platform to support 4 modalities of a language system: listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In this particular example, she utilized it for vocabulary exploration. Here, the students were defining, translating, and using new terms. The platform includes a fill-in-the-blank type of assessment, as well as comprehension questions that students can either listen to or read on their own and then answer. And again, the teachers, this particular example, the National Geographic example, our students have utilized it throughout the year. So again, familiarity makes it a little easier while the students are working at home. The last example, next slide please, is also a high school example. The teacher wanted to focus on culturally relevant instruction to promote engagement, especially during a challenging time. So as a class, they studied the theme of topic of love or marriage across various cultures. As you can imagine, this was a popular topic for high school students. The assignment was scaffolded by language level. So prior to beginning the assignment, a Google Doc, and I've included the beginner sample here, was provided to students with common terminology that they'll hear in the podcast, topics or themes that are important to know prior to digging into the instruction. So students listened to a podcast from The Moth called Is Love Wild or Is Love Real? After listening to the podcast, they completed a Google Form quiz. 100% participation for this particular class, which was wonderful. And the important thing was the completion of the quiz, not necessarily the accuracy of the answers. The answers can give us information about how they listened or how they did in terms of listening, but in terms of engagement, that was the first purpose for this lesson. After completing the Google form quiz, the students did a reading response through Google. So they created a Google slide presentation, and the teacher explained that the criteria were simple. The assessment criteria were not complex. However, the response that the students gave was amazing. They needed to have 5 slides with images, and she provided guidelines for each slide that included information about their culture, was easy to understand, and also included some personal beliefs as well. We'll look at the sample number 2, which is a grade 11 student, an intermediate learner, and the information that he shared from his culture on marriage. So we'll take a minute to look at that. So again, the assessment criteria were not complex, but it did not affect the quality of the students' work. And a bonus in this lesson, in terms of using Google as an assessment, the students were very excited to share about their own culture, and they felt pride. Next slide.
Great. Well, thank you, Violet. As you can see, you saw some really wonderful examples of online platforms that many of us already use. And something that Violetta said I think is key is that they were used to using all of these platforms before going on to remote learning. So doing this at this time is kind of an extension of what they were doing already. And I am sure many of you are doing that already. But what can we do differently or alternatively during this time of remote learning is what we'll talk about here in the next couple of minutes. So can we go on to the next slide, please? One of the things that many of our teachers have done in addition to using all those platforms is using the rubrics flexibly. If they don't have Flipgrid or Seesaw at home, many of our teachers have used the WIDA rubrics, for example, just when they've spoken to students on the phone. They also use the writing rubric with whatever it is that students are handing in, even if it wasn't a task that an ESL or bilingual teacher might have created. They can really use the rubrics flexibly. The last point that I have on this slide I think is key, is flexibility and understanding at this time. Can we go on to the next slide, please? One of the things that we have done, or I wanted to say about flexibility, is that probably everybody who is listening to this webinar understands that we have to be flexible and think a little bit differently for our students. But I just want to remind everybody that we have to encourage others to also keep that flexibility in mind and to keep reminding our colleagues about what our students are going through and the very specific challenges. That's been very eye-opening for me to continue to have to do that. And one of the things that we've done, as Violetta said, instruction looks differently, and so should our goals and expectations for assessment. So we really do have to modify what it is that we're expecting. Next slide, please. One of the things that we have tried to do in Franklin, and again, this is a reminder, Violetta and I are sharing some of the things that we're doing, but please, if you have examples of things that are working for you, please share them in the question box, because one of the goals really is to open up this conversation and share. So if you think of anything as we're speaking that is going to be helpful for others, please share it. I'm going to kind of zoom out and talk a little bit more about process. And consistency is one of those things that we all need to keep in mind. Consistency in making decisions either at the classroom level, at the department level, at the school level, or at the district level. Next slide, please. And I'll share a couple of the things that we are trying to do in Franklin to kind of keep that consistency going at as many levels as possible. We are planning for this remote learning environment in phases. The first phase really was stepping back and getting used to doing this. We were all unsure as to what was going to happen, how long it was going to take. So it was getting used to it. then in context of assessment, the next phase, which we're actually in right now, we introduced a 4-point rubric for feedback. And then now we're planning for third phase, which is really moving into assessment and grading a little bit more formally. So let me talk about all of those things. Next slide, a little bit more in detail. So like I said, we are planning in phases. At our elementary schools, we are in a 6-day cycle. At our high school, we're in a 4-day cycle, and our middle schools are 2 days. So we are planning in phases of 12 days. So the first phase was really, like I said, getting used to things. So the accountability was really, our assessment was really just for attendance only. The second phase is where we introduced kind of an informal feedback rubric. So we needed to kind of give teachers a little bit of guidance as to what they might be saying to students. So next slide, please. This next slide talks a little bit about in the context of completing assignments, what we can say to students. The nice thing about it is that it's a 4-point rubric, which really correlates very nicely to our rubrics at our elementary grades report cards. So all of the rubrics for content areas are set up in 4 points, which is why we did this 4-point rubric, but we tried to let it be a little bit more general and not too specific, because we did have teachers who were saying, oh, but I'm not getting this work and I'm not getting that work. And what about the students we're not getting 100% of work from? It's okay. Take a deep breath. We're all trying to kind of get used, we're all trying to get used to this. So let's just introduce some feedback based on completion. And we kept reminding everybody to be flexible, because our families are going through a lot. So they may not be able to provide everything. At this stage of the game, we were asking for samples of work. Can you give us a sample from the beginning, from one phase, and a sample of another? And that was okay. Many of our students can give us all of their work via Google Classroom or whatever platform they're using, but many of them can't. So next slide, please. Just accepting work in any way that we can get it has been also a reminder for flexibility. Now that we're moving to the third phase, we understand that we have to really address grading in a little bit more formal of a way, especially at the secondary levels, right? Teachers in grades 6 through 12 are anxious about what's going to happen to students. So again, we tried to provide some feedback, next slide please, and guidelines for teachers. Another 4-point rubric to talk about grading, and where we set the expectation at the check plus or the 3. The expectation is that if students are completing their tasks, doing the majority of their work, they're getting a 90. So we kind of set this grading profile out for everybody in grades 6 through 12 to use, where the very, very bottom is a 50. We did not want anybody receiving zeros at all, so we made it kind of impossible for that to happen. And every time we're rolling anything out, we are reminding everybody again to please be flexible, and reminding everybody that sometimes if we don't get work from students, we may have to wait to provide the grades. We are trying to ensure that whatever we do is only going to help students. So we are opening up marking period 4 relatively soon, which is now being rolled out with grades. And we're hoping that this will give students good grades in marking period 4. And then we're going to take those grades and roll them into marking period 3, where it is a little bit more sketchy with numbers and our amount of graded assignments. So we'll take their average from marking period 3 and use it twice in marking period 3, only if it helps the student. So we want to make sure that whatever it is that we're doing is really helping and not being detrimental in any way for any of our students. So we really want to re-emphasize being as flexible as you possibly can, adjusting your expectations for what assessments look like. If you can continue with assessments like you were before, that's great. But please remind your colleagues and everyone you work with that we may really need to be flexible. So next slide, please. If you have any suggestions, again, this is a reminder about how you are assessing your English learners during this distance learning time. Please share your ideas in the question box, because we really, like I said, wanted to open up the conversation for everybody else to share, and it maybe even at least get an idea. So next slide, please. We want to really thank you for having joined us for a few minutes, talking about this timely subject, which is difficult for everybody, but at least we hope you got some ideas. Violetta and I are going to continue in the next presentation, but we would like to invite our colleague, Lucy Licata, to join us for the next section of today's webinar. So we can go on to the next slide. And this section is on supporting families during this time of online learning, and with other issues. So Lucy, if you could introduce yourself and say hi to everybody, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Lucy Licata, and I am an ELL instructional coach for the Red Bank Borough Public Schools.
Next slide, please.
So in this short segment, we want to explore ways that we can support our ELLs families with basic needs, communication, and access to technology and other resources. Next slide.
So as Violetta and Julie mentioned a little bit in their previous presentation, when we're talking about our ELLs and their families, it's super important that before we can focus on academic needs, that we remember to ensure that our students and their families are well. And this includes mental and physical health as well. So some ways that we have listed here that you can ensure that this is occurring is by continuing to utilize your SAC and counselor services, establishing maybe some hotlines or direct connections to those people in your district so that families still have contact. Reaching out to support staff that can also help in communicating with families and reaching out to them. Supporting families in accessing meals. It may be that prior to remote learning, some of them may have not had free or reduced lunch, but their statuses may have changed with everything occurring. And it's super important to consider how you're checking in with families' well-being, how are you connecting with them, and how are you helping bring them a little bit of joy during this time, because it's super important to remember that we're all in this together. Next slide, please. Something we did want to talk about before we get into different platforms is that it's important to remember that not all of our families will have access to the same platforms or the same form of communication. So it's really important that we're ensuring communication for all, regardless of what state they might be in. Important to consider that many of our families still may be without internet connection or devices. And those who do have devices, they may be sharing one device among multiple siblings, and so access might be a little bit difficult. So here we've provided other ways that you can ensure direct communication with families and with your students. Text messaging could be a great avenue to explore because many of your families might have access to cell phones. Directly through the teachers that they are already in communication with is also a great way to maintain that communication line. That's probably somebody that they already feel connected with and trust. Posting up signs in common places and posters that have important information regarding meal distributions or device distributions. There are still places in the community that are opened and that our families are visiting, so that could be one way to communicate with them. Where they don't have to access the internet or a device. Next slide, please. And then we provided you with some common communication apps that have translating features in them. So one of them that our district and the teachers in our district use a lot is Remind, and it's very similar to a text message service. What's nice about that is families can also share pictures of the student work. Talking Points is another one too that offers that option of translation. Class Dojo also allows you to translate messages and families can respond to you. The other two that we included in here, Google Slides and Google Translate, we've also included links to them that you may click on later. The Google Slide has a YouTube video that shows you how to include an add-on to Google Slides that allows you to translate them. Google Translate has also a YouTube link where it's actually in Spanish, and it shares how families can download the Google Translate app on their phone, and they can actually take a picture of a paper or a document and translate that into their language as well. Next slide, please.
So one of our major goals is to facilitate student engagement. We want our students to participate in our Google Meet lessons, to be part of the Zoom morning meetings. So what do we do when we can't reach a student? One of our middle schools has created a systematic tool for monitoring and supporting student engagement. And it starts with the teacher first, as the teacher holds typically the strongest or the closest relationships with the students. So after the teacher's reached out a number of times, if she or he has been unsuccessful, the guidance counselors become involved and reach out as well. And additionally, administrators do as well, assistant principals, even central administration staff. Together they collaborate and they utilize this tool to record their communication. Next slide, please. This Google Doc includes engagement and communication for 780 middle school students in one of our schools. It's organized by week. You can see the tabs lower at the bottom. So by week, they monitor student engagement, and each subject area teacher records excellent interaction, average interaction, minimal interaction, or no interaction. Next slide, please. It also includes a component for communication. It allows the school to document communication and be cautious not to overwhelm families. If families are struggling, or if they have a family member who's been infected with the virus, we don't want the ELA teacher, the humanities teacher, the math teacher, and the science teacher all reaching out on the same day to let them know there's a missing assignment. We want to be sensitive and we want to be thoughtful in our communication, and this tool has helped this particular middle school provide that for families. Next slide. I've included a link to the template. Should you want to utilize this with your students or with your school or with your department, feel free to click on this link. It's a copy. Next slide. In addition, during these really uncharted times, we've been purposeful in creative and utilizing our internal resources, as I'm sure many districts have. So last year, our district's Culture Proficiency, Equity, and Character Education Committee created a Google Forms survey to collect data for all our multilingual staff. And we're pretty fortunate to have a number of staff members who speak 1 or 2 or 3 or more languages. Well, that came in handy these last 7 weeks. We've utilized the We Speak survey to identify staff who can support ELL families. For instance, one of our educational assistants in a middle school who speaks Hindi was able to support a Hindi family at the elementary level, which he or she's never met, and just help their student or their child get onto Google Classroom, learn how to turn in an assignment in Google Classroom, because that can be tricky if you've never used it before. And once the student was able to get started and the parents were able to help the student get on the platform, that's all the support they needed in order to engage from home. So sometimes a quick 5-minute conversation in a native language can help a student get started. Next slide. Here's an example of the We Speak survey. Again, we're pretty fortunate to have a number of staff members that are multilingual, and I'm sure your districts have them as well.
In addition to what Violetta mentioned in her district, our district also utilized or is utilizing support staff that speaks other languages to assist classroom teachers get in touch with families and students that they may not have heard from since remote learning began, or that they don't have the ability to communicate with because they don't speak their native language. So we've actually assigned translators to each grade level, which works out nicely because that way the teacher has a direct communication with one person. And as Violetta mentioned, we're not overwhelming families by having multiple people contact the family multiple times. It creates a great pathway for communication. Next slide.
I think a lot of what Violetta and Lucy have been talking about go back to a couple of ideas that are important as far as streamlining information for our students and families and ensuring that they get the information, right? also, as speaking of that, knowing that our ESL and bilingual teachers have the closest relationship, as Violetta mentioned, is ensuring that district leadership knows about this. I can also say as an example in Franklin, and I'm sure in many places, the mode of communication for most families is phone blast, is making sure that notices go out via phone or email. We were finding that many of our families were not getting those messages. So I was able to remind our leadership that we need different ways of communicating. So now we are part of that communication loop. Before messages go out, they send it to me so I can have ESL and bilingual teachers distribute that message via all of those things that Lucy mentioned, Remind, class, dojo, all of the things that teachers are using to get to communicate with their families, to get the messages out there, because they were not getting them the way that the district was sending them out. So access to devices and internet, we all are probably experiencing what's happening at this moment, where we are seeing the equity gaps that might have been existent before are now highlighted and accentuated in this time. Having a technological divide is one of those equity gaps that is probably being highlighted, and districts have addressed all this before this happened. So everybody had access, but it's not the case everywhere. There are companies out there that do have free resources, like Comcast Internet Essentials. We've noted a couple here. We do know, in my experience, that even though that these services are available, they've been very difficult to get. Many of our families have tried to contact, they couldn't find someone, they couldn't get a call back, or the companies have actually said, we don't provide the service where you are. So it's been very difficult. So that has triggered a lot of our district leadership to really think flexibly again about how to get devices and hotspots to students. So we're moving forward, and I hope many of you are doing the same, or many of you have already done that. We did identify a pocket of students and families who didn't have, still didn't, even though we've done 2 different distributions of devices, and we can't find hotspots. I don't know if any of you are trying to purchase them, but nobody has them anymore because they were in such high demand. So we're actually purchasing phones that are going to be configured as hotspots only. So again, being as flexible as we can is the name of the game right now. If we can go to the next slide, would be really helpful. The support that we're providing our students for this online platform also varies, right? Our students who've had the access don't need that much of a support because they know how to use Seesaw, they know how to use all those. But what about the students who are just getting these devices? We've had to kind of sit back and think about how to support families. So teachers are being incredibly creative and creating videos, like one of the ones that Lucy put in this presentation, where she's in Spanish doing a how-to kind of video. Even just telling students how to turn in an assignment in Google has been a big issue, and how to create Google Slides, how to put the translation, all of that. So again, thinking flexibly of how to support our students, and also making sure that teachers and our colleagues know that there is this learning curve. If students have not been used to being online as the most, as a mode of communication or as a mode of learning, there is a learning curve. So again, we've got to remind everybody to be flexible and offer ways to support, which we have been doing. If we could go to the next slide, please.
So many of our community partners are also offering free resources. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind here is to balance. We don't want to overwhelm our families, we don't want to overwhelm our students or our parents, but we do want to utilize what's available. So you know your students the best. You know what they need and what they can handle, and when is a good time to introduce something new. But so sharing some of the community offerings. In Cherry Hill, our local library and our county library are offering thousands of free ebooks, audiobooks, access to movies, access to music through Hoopla, Overdrive, and Libby, and I'm sure your local libraries are doing the same. We're just a short 8 miles away from Philadelphia, so we consider Philadelphia our community as well. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, as I'm sure many other museums are doing, are offering virtual tours. They're offering access to their galleries virtually, so students can take a field trip online. The Franklin Institute's offering scavenger hunts, science recipes with a lot of household materials that you might have at home. They're offering bad science lessons, which I've participated in too, like, is sunshine really yellow? Does a camel really have water in his or her hump? Lots of interactive things for students. The National Constitution Center is also offering virtual town halls and live classes. And many of our social studies middle school content area teachers who also support our ELLs have been utilizing the National Constitution Center as support, offering visuals, offering videos, offering an audio support in order to access curriculum. I know many of your districts have a lot of offerings as well, your communities. So please be on the lookout of what's there, but balance what students are able to handle.
Just as an aside, something else that's happening in Franklin is local churches have reached out to the school district to ask how they can also help. So we are organizing a way of getting gift cards to grocery stores to families who are in real need, and that's thanks to the churches in our community who reached out to us. Speaking of churches who've reached out, as I was doing some research, I saw a website that churches across the United States have put together called getboxesofhope.com, where they will send a box of materials to people who are in need because of the COVID-19. So look into your communities as well. Next slide, please.
There have been so many platforms and so many great websites and resources shared throughout this webinar, and I'm sure throughout other webinars you've attended and on social media. Many websites are offering free access, which is also really great, but it's also important to consider how overwhelming this can be for families. We know it's probably overwhelming for staff members and teachers to take it in. So it's important that as educators, we filter some of this information for our families. Some ways that we can make all of these great resources more accessible to our families is by using one consistent platform. As my colleagues have mentioned before, a lot of the online platforms that they are currently using in their districts, the students already had exposure to prior to school closure, and that makes a big difference. So using consistent platforms for communication and posting assignments on a consistent platform can be one way that we can help our families navigate this new way of learning. Additionally, providing families with at-home learning schedules to help balance all of these different structures for their children at home. And just ensuring, as Violetta and Julie mentioned with community resources, that there's a balance of online tasks with other activities that also promote speaking, listening, reading, and writing at home that can be done with minimal supplies and that don't always involve a device. Next slide, please.
So I think we've talked a little bit about, what to do for families who don't have devices and internet, but we have mailed paper packets for those families who didn't have access. We really are trying very hard to move towards a remote learning online platform, which is why we're making such a huge effort to make sure that everybody has a device and Wi-Fi at home. We've thought flexibly about how to use the buses that are being currently used to deliver meals to either collect information or to deliver. So we're actually contracting our bus company to deliver the devices and the hotspots when we're ready. So not necessarily at mealtime, but using the transportation company that right now doesn't have a ton of work to do. And just being flexible with our accountability for students and assignments. We mentioned this already, that students can submit their work either by taking a picture of it and sending it, texting it, emailing it, and being flexible with being able to assess and look at things later when students can actually bring us things in paper form if we can't get it right now. Next slide, please. So the last thing I think we all want to say, the three of us, is to remind all of us on this webinar how important it is to advocate, advocate, and advocate, and be the voice of those students who may not be able to speak for themselves right now. I think people know a lot of what the needs are, but they don't know what the needs are until we keep reminding everybody what they are, that our families are still, many of our families are still suffering deportations at this moment. Even on top of COVID, I've had 2 families who I've heard of the situation. I'm sure many of you have had families who've reported deaths in the family because of the situation that we are in. So I just want to remind everybody that this is the time to really speak up, as uncomfortable as it's been for me. And I keep saying that I am sorry to be the thorn in your side, but what about the families? What about these families who don't have? What about, how is this decision going to affect our English learners? What about this is going to make it better for our English learners? And kind of really forcing the hand for all of us to really think about what students may need at this time. So can we go to the next slide, please?
So we just wanted to leave you with this final message that together we are stronger. So we want you to consider sharing your best practices with your colleagues, sharing with your families, continuing to be a part of your professional learning networks, and consider these questions that we have here. You can share some in the chat, in the questions box with us. What strategies have worked for you? What has been successful for your ELL families as well? We look forward to reading all of your questions. Next slide, please. We just want to thank you for participating. Yeah. And we wanted to leave you with our information. So I wanted to thank Julie and Violetta for presenting all of these resources with me. And we want to introduce our final colleague, who is going to talk to you about social emotional learning and culturally responsive instruction in virtual lessons. So I leave you with Sandra.
Sandra, I think you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We will continue the conversation on how to incorporate social emotional learning strategies and culturally responsive instruction in virtual lessons today. Next slide, please. Before we even get into the objectives for this section, I'd like you to imagine the following question and maybe participate in the chat. If you were a student, what would you want most from your teacher right now? Next slide, please. And of course, putting ourselves in our students and our teachers' shoes. Like we've said before, we might have students that have access to a mobile phone. Maybe they have access to that phone, but they have to wait for a parent to come home from work. Maybe they have to share that device with other siblings. We may have students that don't have access to devices, that they have access only to printable packets that we have distributed in our districts. You may have students that do have their own device, their Chromebook or laptop. Do they have it just for their own use, or maybe they have to share it with other siblings as well? We also need to consider the situation our families are facing. Are they the size of the family? Are they sharing a household with other family members? How many siblings? We need to consider the situation that our teachers are facing. They are asked to plan, develop, and implement virtual lessons to a group of students, and at the same time take care of their own families and tutor their own children. And last, we need to consider the learning environment that our kids are being exposed to. Is it the best learning environment? Next slide, please. So our objectives for today is to look at, or continue looking, because a lot of other things have been mentioned before as to how emotions affect learning. Why is it important that we consider social emotionally learning in using virtual learning? And why is it important that we have culturally relevant lessons incorporated? and sharing with you some strategies that promote the well-being of our students during this time, and giving you additional resources to tap into to help our students. Next slide, please. So the fact is that in times of uncertainty and unpredictability, we are all learning from each other. And one of our goals today is to share some strategies with you, but also learn from you. So please give us in the chat your ideas on how to improve our instructional learning on a virtual setting. The question is, how can we support children in feeling emotionally safe, cope with stress, manage fear, and still continue learning? Next slide, please. So the first thing is we need to understand how emotions affect learning. Next slide, please. Here you will see an illustration of the brain learning centers, and there are three main ones. The prefrontal cortex regulates thoughts, emotion, behavior. The hippocampus, that is where knowledge, learning is stored, and memory. And the amygdala, the part that reacts to stress and emotional arousal, and they all work together. And let's see in the next slide how when in times of toxic stress, high stress, and hormone cortisol is released, and this can affect the way the three parts of the brain interact, affecting our emotions, how we manage our emotions, how we manage our behavior, how we actually have the capacity to learn and to remember. And all these are basic components that determine students' academic success. Next slide, please. The fact is that we're all connected. Not only those physiological factors affect us, but we also do all belong to different networks. We have our families, we have our work environment, our work groups, we have our community, our large groups, our churches, membership to different communities that we communicate with. And we also come with all different kind of cultural backgrounds, different cultural perspectives on how we see the world around us. And now we're being asked to work together, learn together in a basically virtual learning platform, or at least kind of isolated in our homes without that human contact. Next slide, please. So what is social emotional learning? Social emotional learning is the process with which we combine our knowledge, our skills, to help understand and manage our emotions, set goals, establish relationship with others, and make decisions, and handle stress, anger, fear during challenging situations. How to handle these effectively. Next slide, please. And in supporting students, we need to consider relationships, culture, and resilience. We know that establishing positive relationships affect our students in a positive way. Connecting to their cultural background will actually validate them and validate their emotions and their needs at this time. And how do we maximize student learning? Certainly continue to lead and teach with compassion and flexibility is very supportive of students. Next slide, please. We know that relationships are essential to all of us. Research tells us that when we have positive relationships, we turn to live longer lives. We bolster our immune system. We tend to be more physically fit. We're able to make better decisions and healthier choices, and we heal better. Next slide, please. We know that culture is what defines us. It's what really binds us to one another. How we actually live our lifestyle, our food, traditions, culture, music. It is who we are, not only how we look. It is much more deeper than that. It is what really defines us in our community. Next slide, please. And together with that, resilience is really the capacity to put it all together so we can manage our emotions and surpass all challenges, regardless of all odds. In 1994, Lifton identify resilience as the human capacity of all individuals to transform and change no matter what their risk was. Maston in 2001 defined resilience as the good outcomes in spite of serious threats to adaptation or development. Next slide, please. So again, in the chat, if you'd like to share, what do you think are the characteristics of resilient individuals when a situation seems impossible, when the obstacles are insurmountable, when we are overloaded, overstretched, and overwhelmed by accomplishing our tasks? Next slide, please. Characteristic of resilient individuals, generally, you will see here many focus on self-control, self-efficacy, management of emotions, usually optimistic individuals that can express appreciation and gratitude, that can set their goals, be able to achieve their goals, and be flexible. Next slide, please. But, you know, in order to take care of others, we need to take care of ourselves. Next slide, please. And we know that emotional intelligence in the resilient educator is extremely important at this time because teachers are being asked to support students. Knowing that we need to increase our resilience skills so that we acknowledge our own emotions. We will have some days better than others. We need to develop our own coping mechanisms and take care of ourselves to be able to support and take care of our students, either being exercising, meditation, journaling, establishing boundaries between our personal life and our duties as educators. It's really, really important. I'd like to quote Palmer in his, an author. Parker Palmer states that self-care is never a selfish act, that any time we can listen to our true self and give the care it requires, we do it not only for ourselves, but for the many others whose life we touch. Next slide, please. So some strategies are that we could create routines and structures for our students, share personalized messages, provide opportunities for them to express themselves, integrate culturally relevant opportunities and experiences for our students, and activities that connect to the real world. Next slide, please. More strategies would be to ask open-ended questions. Let the students express their feelings, their emotions. Build their skill and goal-setting skills. Encourage them to work and help one another. Provide opportunities for self-reflection and allow them to be creative. Offer student choice in the activities that we propose. Next slide, please. I want to share some of the messages. These messages were shared with me in Ms. Isabel Cruz, ESL teacher at Daylight Twilight High School, opened her classroom, Google Classroom, with powerful messages. Your power is in your mind, in your heart, in your faith. Before we started our spring break, she gave them some ideas on how to spend their time. Expression of care, I miss you, for example. The last message is in Spanish, but it's encouraging students, our heroes, like she calls them, to help other students to navigate the virtual learning world. Next slide, please. In this part, Ms. Melanie Tardy, ESL teacher at Trenton 9th Grade Academy, on Padlet, she asked them, do you enjoy learning online? The kids were able to take pictures of themselves and express their emotions and their feelings as they were isolated from their peers. Next slide, please. In this short video, you will see, it's about a minute long, personal messages that encourage students to stay connected. This is from Harrison Elementary School. We want to thank Principal Keisha Gaiman and staff for allowing us to view. There's a longer video that's available on YouTube. If we can watch that now, please. We want to thank Kelly Fuller for putting it together for us, ESL teacher at Harrison.
Thank you for helping your child complete their assignments. Thank you for encouraging them to do their very best.
Hola.
A todos mis halcones, Harrison. Te amo y te extraño muchísimo. Hello to all of my Harrison Hawks. I love and miss you dearly.
I wanted to send out a quick message and say hello, and I miss you, and I'm proud of you for all the work you've put in this week.
This is a very different type of situation for us, but I want to encourage you to maintain a positive attitude about all of this. We will pull through this together.
You guys are doing a really great job on Google Classrooms. I wanted to say hi and to say that I miss you. I miss you. You are brave. You have very smart brains, and you are the best.
Just wanted to say hi and that I miss you and hope everybody's doing okay.
You can reach out to any of us for assistance. Bye.
Next slide, please. I know that we have run out of time. I just want to show you our last one here. Mr. Edgar Villa is, we might not be able to see the video. He's actually singing in the video. He provided the lyrics to the song. They were actually researching different countries, and he opened that lesson asking the kids, which countries would you like to visit? Next slide, please. In his lesson, he gave them reading assignments. In one of the reading parts, actually, there's a picture of him visiting Colombia. There's an assessment piece, giving the opportunity for kids to choose what to research, maybe their own country, their native country, or any other part of the world. Is a great way to keep them engaged in culturally relevant information. Next slide, please. Distance learning challenge. Be creative. Don't forget to have fun and infuse fun in the learning day. Maybe if you were used to having a student of the week, a student of the month, give them still that virtual certificate. Maybe a certificate that's for the challenge superhero. The next slide will give you multiple resources that can infuse culturally relevant information and more information on social emotional learning. I think we have ended our section here. I'm sorry I had to rush you through because we'd like a little time here. We want to thank PSA and FEA, Mary Reese, all the presenters, and last but not least, all our teachers, our wonderful teachers in all our districts that are dedicated, they are committed to engage students in learning, and you are our heroes as well. Please remember to stay safe, stay healthy, stay strong. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne and Julie, Violetta, Lucy, and Sandra, for sharing with our audience your wealth of experiences and your knowledge. Your thoughtful ideas will support the tremendous work that so many are doing, working with our ELLs and with their families. As I've said to you before, we will respond to your questions and send them out to you. We will also send to you the links for the webinars from last week and this week, along with those PowerPoints too. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to Ellen and Rob for providing the technical assistance to making this webinar come together so easily. Thank you all. You're doing amazing work, and your students can only benefit from your passion and your support. Thank you, everyone.